Joining us on the live stream. It's so nice to be with you in our virtual sanctuary. I'm going to hand it over to Rabbi Schaefer to introduce a little bit about tonight.
Thank you, Rabbi Berkman. Shabbat Shalom and welcome everybody, whether you're joining us on Zoom or Facebook, on TOS Live or Brookline Public Access TV. We're really grateful to have you, especially as we mark this special Shabbat of National Refugee Shabbat. We're thrilled to have Jerry Rubin, the CEO of Jewish Vocational Services, with us tonight to speak with us and to have the chance to learn with him as we approach the holiday of Passover, where we celebrate our freedom from slavery and our move into being free people. And we know that so many people are struggling to find freedom today, and 70 million people who are refugees around the world or displaced people seeking homes, and that this is an international problem, and that the United States, as well as many other countries, has a small role to play. So it's a chance for us to learn about the problem on a global scale, about what's happening on a national level, and also about what's happening here in Boston and what we can do to help people. And we'll be highlighting this throughout the night. And we hope you'll join us to bring your voices to this Shabbat, to learn about the refugee situation around the world and to learn with us. And we're going to begin in a few moments with candle lighting, but I'll hand it back to Rabbi Berkman to bring us into Shabbat tonight.
So you can never have too much deep breathing, I think. What you could call belly breathing. Make sure your belly is expanding and contracting as you're breathing. And maybe as you're breathing, you're becoming more aware of how you're really feeling. Maybe you were rushing around just before services, but wherever you're coming from, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, physically, you are a really important part of our virtual sanctuary tonight. That's one of the lessons we learn right around this part of Torah as the Israelites build their portable Mishkan, their place for the Holy One to dwell, that each of them brings their unique gifts and their unique resources. And wherever they are coming from, they are vital to the construction of the whole that is bigger than the sum of its parts. So too, we create a holy space in which each one of us plays a really important role. So let's come into being fully present tonight with our breath, checking in with ourselves so that we can better check in with and connect with each other, and welcome Shabbat with an expansiveness in our heart space, our lung space, and our soul space. We'll begin with candle lighting. We're on page 2 if you're in the book or the digital book, which we've pasted in the chat for you if you'd like to go to that link. And of course, please feel free to light candles along with me if you have your candles available. And if you do, bring your candles into your Zoom square so we can light up our virtual sanctuary. Baruch, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu lehadlik ner shel Shabbat. So another way that we can create a sense of really being together in virtual community is, at least for those of us on the Zoom or maybe those of us on Facebook, if you want to just say Shabbat Shalom in the chat, greet others, and even just leave a word about how you're feeling right now, that can help us feel more connected to each other. And while you're doing that, we're going to get ready to welcome the angels of Shabbat with Shalom Aleichem on page 24. And we are happy to welcome my eldest son, Gavi Berkman, who will accompany me as we accompany and welcome our angels. Again, we're on page 24. Shalom Aleichem, Malachei Hasharet, Malachei Elyon. Melech Malachei Hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Boachem leShalom, Malachei HaShalom, Malachei Elyon. Melech Malachei Hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Baruch Hu leShalom, Malachei HaShalom, Malachei Elyon. Melech Malachei Hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Sing itchem leShalom, Malachei HaShalom, Malachei Melech Malachei Hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Thank you, Gavi. Lots of guitar practicing over these last many months has paid off, and it's a nice special perk I get to have and leading services. So we are going to move into Psalm 96 on page 18. And just yai-da-dai if it's not so familiar to you. Clap along as the Spirit moves you. One of our most ancient texts. We're not on page 18. No, we are. Okay. No, that's Psalm 29. We are on page 13. There we go. Psalm 96. Shiru l'Adonai shir chadash, shiru l'Adonai kol haaretz, shiru l'Adonai baruchu shemo, basru miyom leyom yeshuato, sapru vagoyim kevodo, bechol ha'amim niflotav, ki gadol Adonai, umehulal meod, norahu, al kol Elohim, yai lai lai, ki kol Elohe ha'amim elilim, v'Adonai shamayim asa, hod v'hadar lefanav, עוז ותפארת במקדשו, ילאי לי לי לי, ילאי לי ילאי לי, ילאי לי לי לי, ילאי לי לי לי, לי 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 לי, ילאי לי לי לי, ילאי לי לי לי, ילאי לי לי לי.
turn to Lecha Dodi, which can be found on page 20. And Lecha Dodi was written by Rabbi Shlomo Halevi Alkabaitz, a 16th century Kabbalistic rabbi living in Sfat. And the rabbis of Sfat were rabbis who, in a way, were living in exile. They were Sephardic descendants who had been exiled from their land in Spain and Portugal. And they understood the state of spiritual exile, even though they were living in the Holy Land. They understood the longing, that desire to return to a previous state. And on this Refugee Shabbat, I invite you to tap into that feeling of exile and that desire to return, that yearning to return that our ancestors felt as they wrote this and as they sang this to welcome the Shabbat bride. We'll sing together verses 1, 2, 5, and 9. And I invite you to rise for the 9th stanza as we turn and greet the Shabbat bride.
On page 21 and 20 and 21. Lecha dodi likrat kala, pnei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha dodi likrat kala, pnei Shabbat nekabela. Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad, השמיענו אל המיוחד, אדוני אחד ושמו אחד, לשם ולתפארת ולתהילה. לך דודי, לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לקראת שבת לכו ונלכה, כי היא מקור הברכה, מראש מקדם נסוכה, סוף מעשה במחשבה תחילה. לך דודי, לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לקראת שבת לכו ונלכה, כי היא מקור הברכה, מראש מקדם נסוכה, סוף מעשה במחשבה תחילה. Verse 5. התעוררי, התעוררי, כי באורך קומי אורי, אורי אורי, שיר דברי, כבוד אדוני עלייך נגלה. לך דודי, לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. Verse 9. בואי ושלום עטרת בעלה, גם בשמחה ובצולה, תוך אמוני עם סגולה. בואי חלה, בואי חלה. לך דודי, לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. So we are going to move into a portion of our psalm for Shabbat, our Ma Gadlu round, our How Amazing Is This World round. And I'm going to invite a couple of people to share a moment of what Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel would call radical amazement, and that radical amazement, even at things that we might necessarily think of as so amazing, should be at the heart of Jewish theology. So if anyone would like to share, and I'm going to take that moment to retrieve my accompanist for our Magadlu round and my round partner while you share. So I will let Rabbi Schaefer facilitate this part.
If there's anybody who would like to share, just please take a moment and raise your hand, unmute yourself. I will share. This has been an exciting week at TOS. Many of our staff are now eligible to get the vaccine because they work at a preschool. And so it's been really thrilling to see so many of our coworkers get their first vaccines and be on their way, and to know that so many people in our community are also in that process just gives me a lot of hope.
Is there maybe one more person that would like to share? Okay, well, if you think of anything and want to put it in the chat, we would love to see it. The birth of your first grandchild, Larry and Muriel, Mazel Tov, that's amazing, and you saw it. Well, that is a Magadlu moment I don't know that any of us could beat. So happy for you, Mazel Tov. So we'll be at the top of page 342 if you're following along. Feel free to just close your eyes and think about something amazing, even if it's something small. That can be the most amazing. Doesn't have to be witnessing the birth of a human being who is your grandchild. It could be something much smaller than that. And we say, hallelujah. Let us praise Yah, the mystery, the source of all life, as we sing, how great, how profound are the mysteries of this world. How great is this gift of life. Magadu, Masechaya. Thank you to everyone who shared. Thank you to Rabbi Jethro Berkman for accompanying me. And transitioning from Kabbalat Shabbat into the Ma'ariv service, I'll chant Chatzi Kaddish on page 26. Yitkadal ve'yitkadash shemei Rabbav ve'alma divrach chirutei ve'amlich malchutei בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי כל בית ישראל בעגלה ובזמן קורי ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבא מבורך לעלם ולעלמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתהלל שמי קודשא בריחו לעילם עם כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה תאמירן בעלמא ואמרו אמן. So please rise in body or spirit for the Baruch Hu, the call to prayer. It's on page 28. And we're going to invite those here on the Zoom, if you wish, to unmute yourselves for the response to help us feel even more connected as a community. And we know that those here on the Zoom are just representing all of the rest of you who are tuning in from wherever you may be. Baruch hu et Adonai HaMevorach.
Baruch Adonai HaMevorach Laed.
Baruch Adonai HaMevorach Leolam Vaed.
We're welcome to be seated. If you're following along in the prayer book, please join me at the bottom of page 31. This is an hour of change. Within it, we stand uncertain on the border of light. Shall we draw back or cross over? Where shall our hearts turn? Shall we draw back, my brother, my sister, or cross over? This is the hour of change, and within it we stand quietly on the border of light. What lies before us? Shall we draw back, my brother, my sister, or cross over? Baruch atah Adonai Hama'ariv Aravim.
We'll turn to page 32. ואהבתך אל תסיר ממנו לעולמים, ברוך אתה אדוני, אוהב עמו Yisrael. Before we move into the Shema, I actually want to take a pause, and I wanted to share a reflection that is connected to Refugee Shabbat that can remind us, as I like to reflect upon before I recite the Shema, the way that oneness, when we say Adonai Echad, that unity reminds us that we are all interconnected and invaluable parts of a holy wholeness. So as noted in the materials prepared by Hayas for this National Refugee Shabbat, at the very beginning of the Torah portion for this week, Ki Tisa, Moses is instructed to take a half shekel from every person over the age of 20 when he takes a census of the community. This teaches us that people are not just numbers to be counted, but valuable human beings who have valuable contributions to make. And as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to the building of the tabernacle, everybody has to contribute something. Here too, the same contribution is expected of everyone, regardless of financial ability, and perhaps that tells us that no human being is more valuable than another. So as they're counting human beings in this census, there is a certain way in which we're reminded to value every human being. And so when we think about how to integrate refugees and asylum seekers and displaced people into our communities, it can be easy to look as if it's a monolith, a number of 80 million or so. But we should remember that those many millions are made up of one and one and one and one, and each should be respected as individuals and as vital members of that holy wholeness. So with that kavanah, we can close our eyes, just feeling the unity, the interconnectedness of all of humanity as we recite the Shema. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Leolam Vaed. If we're following along in the book, we're on page 36 for V'ahavta. V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בעם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשוכבך ובקומך
וקשרתם לאות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך, למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אדוני אלוהיכם, אמן.
I want to invite you for a moment to just think about your own family history and reflect on where your ancestors came from, to think about maybe the first person who came to this country or one particular ancestor whose story you know. I was sharing about my family's history and their travels from Riga, Latvia, where my dad's side came from, and Zagreb, Croatia, where my mom's side came from, and the Ukraine. And hearing about their journeys, it usually was one person coming over at a time, one family member who they were able to save enough money for, who could take the trip to this country until they could earn enough money to send back, and for another person to come. And in my family, they didn't come over all at once. They came over one at a time. And I don't know who the first person was in those extended families to make that trip, but it makes me think of the rabbinic tradition of Nachshon, who is famously the first one who stepped into the Sea of Reeds when the Israelites were up against the water with Pharaoh closing down behind them. He is the one who took that first courageous step into the water, not knowing if it was going to part and not knowing if they were going to make it across. And somebody in our families probably took that first step, not knowing how it was going to work out, whether you know their story or you don't. I encourage you to reflect on that, to think about them, and to invite their presence in as we turn to Mi Chamocha on page 40 and we sing the song of redemption.
Okay, just one moment.
Adonai, mi chamocha nehedar b'hakodesh, nora tehilot osei fele, nora tehilot osei fele, malchutecha ra'u vanecha, בוקי הים לפני משה ומרים, זה אלי ענו ואמרו אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד. יאי לי 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 לי, יאי לי 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 לי, יאי לי לי לי, יאי לי 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 לי, yai lai 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 lai, ya lai 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 lai, ya lai lai, yai lai, ya lai 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 lai, yai lai.
We don't want anybody going to sleep quite yet tonight, but perhaps there's somebody in your household who does need to go to sleep, or at least needs a little calming down. I know my puppy Ruby could use a little lullaby right now, and so I'm going to let her in as we sing Hashkivenu, our prayer for peace, and our little lullaby, which can be found on page 42 in our prayer books.
Hashkivenu Adonai, Eloheinu l'shalom, v'hamidenu shomrei everything's gonna be alright. Go to sleep tonight. Everything's gonna be alright. Everything's gonna be alright. Everything's gonna be alright. Go to sleep tonight. Hashkidenu Adonai, Eloheinu leShalom, ve'hamidenu shomreinu lechaim. As I always like to remind us as we pray God to spread a canopy of peace over us, we remind ourselves that we need to create that canopy of peace. We're going to sing Ufros Aleinu Sukat Shlomecha, asking God to spread that canopy over us. But we can be that for each other, and especially this refugee Shabbat, when we think of helping our nation be a refuge for those who need it, and also to be a refuge as individuals for those who need it, by always extending our care and compassion to others so that they can feel safe and protected and welcome. And as I've said many times before, I believe when we get in touch with that sense of peace and safety and security that I hope we've all known at least once in our life, if not right at this moment, that we can access that place in us that feels held and safe, and that can enable us to create and to be a canopy of peace for others. We're going to have a chance now to chant the first three blessings of the amidah together. I invite you to rise in body or spirit for the amidah. We'll have some moments of quiet reflection, prayer from the words in the prayer book or words in your heart this evening, and then we'll join back together with a prayer for peace. We'll begin on page 46. Adonai sifatai tiftach Ufi Yagid Tehilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips that my mouth may declare your praise. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu, Elohei Avotenu v'Imotenu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Leah, Ha'el Hagadol, Hagibor v'Hanora, El Elyon Gomel, Chasadim Tovim v'Konei Hakol, V'Zocher Chasdei Avot v'Imahot, ומביא גאולה לבני בניהם, למען שמו ביהבה. מלך עוזר ומושיע ומגן, ברוך אתה אדוני, מגן אברהם ועזרת שרה. אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני, מחיי הכל אתה רב להושיע. משיב הרוח ומוריד הגשם, מכלכל חיים בחסד, מחיי הכל ברחמים רבים, סומך נופלים ורופא חולים, ומתיר אסורים, ומקיים אמונתו לשני עפר. מי כמוך בעל גבורות ומי דומה לך, מלך ממית ומחיה ומצמיח ישועה, ונאמן אתה לחיות הכל. ברוך אתה אדוני מחיי הכל. אתה קדוש ושמך קדוש, וקדושים בכל יום יהללוך סלה. ברוך אתה אדוני האל הקדוש. We continue individually. As we're ready, we'll join together in a prayer for peace, page 62. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל. יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל. יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל. יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל. Going to take this opportunity to offer a prayer for our country. I'm going to share this on the screen, so please feel free to join me. This was written by Rabbi Ayelet Cohen. Our God and God of our ancestors, bless this country and all who dwell within it. Help us to experience the blessings of our lives and circumstances, to be vigilant, compassionate, and brave. Strengthen us when we are afraid. Help us to channel our anger so that it motivates us to action. Help us to feel our fear so that we do not become numb. Help us to be generous with others so that we raise each other up. Help us to be humble in our fear, knowing that as vulnerable as we feel, there are those at greater risk, and that it is our holy work to stand with them. Help us to taste the sweetness of liberty, to not take for granted the freedoms won in generations past or in recent days, to heal and nourish our democracy that it may be like a tree planted by the water whose roots reach down to the stream. It need not fear drought when it comes. Its leaves are always green. Source of all life, guide our leaders with righteousness, strengthen their hearts but keep them from hardening, that they may use their influence and authority to speak truth and act for justice. May all who dwell in this country share in its bounty, enjoy its freedoms, and be protected by its laws. May this nation use its power and wealth to be a voice for justice, peace, and equality for all who dwell on earth. May we be strong and have courage, to be bold in our action and deep in our compassion, to discern when we must listen and when we must act, to uproot bigotry, intolerance,
misogyny, racism, discrimination, and violence in all its forms. To celebrate the many faces of God reflected in the wondrous diversity of humanity. To welcome the stranger and the immigrant, and to honor the gifts of those who seek refuge and possibility here, as they have since before this nation was born. Let justice well up like waters, and righteousness like a mighty stream. And at this time, we call to mind those who are in need of healing. So many we know and don't know, those who are suffering as a result of COVID, and those in our personal orbits, family, friends, for whom we're praying for a healing of body or spirit. We will sing our prayer on page 253. And I'd ask, if you're thinking of anyone, if you have the ability to type into the chat, please feel free to type names there. And I'll hand it over to Rabbi Schaefer to read names connected to our community.
Right, as a community, we pray for the healing of Anita Kulik, Judy Goldberg, Kate Bingham, Eileen Schwartz, Chava Esther, Bat Chaya Rucho, V'chaim Yona, Sarah Robinson, Esther Neshama, Tammy Griffin, Richard and Margit Hershey, Karen Shea, Doug and Mila Krynick, Liesl Allen, Marcia Susan, Shitra Dwarka, Eddie Alicia, Merle Neerman. We add to those names the names that are in our heart this evening, as well as the names of Betty Morningstar, Myron Frommer, Martha Joy Aft. We turn together to page 253, and we sing together this prayer for healing in the middle of the page.
Mi sheberach avotenu mekor habracha leimotenu. May the source of strength, who blessed the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, Amen. Mi sheberach imotenu mekor habracha lavotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say, Amen.
We wish them a refuah shlema, a complete and speedy recovery. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce a longtime member of Temple Ohabei Shalom and a board member of Jewish Vocational Services, Susan, who will introduce our guest speaker tonight. And Susan, thank you for making this shidduch, this connection, and for helping to bring Jerry and JVS with us tonight. So we've been waiting a long time, a whole year for this moment. And so I'm so thrilled and excited to have you introducing him and to be able to learn from him tonight. So please, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Rabbi Schaefer. And I've got to give a shout out to Judy Sachs, so I can see on the screen, because she was also instrumental in this. So thank you, Judy. I'm really thrilled to be introducing Jerry, CEO of Jewish Vocational Service, and an organization that holds a special place in my heart as a bridge between social justice imperatives and the Jewish community. So JVS originally took root in 1938 during the Great Depression to assist Jewish immigrants and refugees struggling to enter the American workforce. Jerry is an innovator, thinker, and doer in the social justice space, honoring the Jewish legacy of Tikkun Olam and Tzedakah. He's built an exceptional record of leadership in changing people's lives for the better. Since taking the helm at JVS 14 years ago, Jerry has led the organization to become the gold standard in workforce development, helping refugees and immigrants from our most distressed communities enter the workforce by teaching them the skills they need to sustain a decent life. Today's JVS serves individuals from over 67 countries, speaking 59 languages, seeking a better life, just as our Jewish forebears did. So Jerry speaks out on what matters. He's an influential and respected voice in our community. He's a member of the Boston Federal Reserve Bank's Community Development Advisory Council, on the board of the Economic Empowerment Trust of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the Massachusetts Immigration and Refugee Coalition. He's also one of an elite group of Boston leaders that was selected for the 2019 class of Bar Fellows, hoping to have gone to Lebanon, but it didn't happen because of COVID. But it's an extraordinary program supported by the Bar Foundation. And on a personal note, Jerry describes himself as the son of pragmatic activists. He's an avid reader, hiker, lover of classical music, and grandfather of Ezra. So Jerry, thank you for being with us tonight, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Susan. And you might hear Ezra in the background because he's visiting right now and eating dinner just outside the door here. Thank you so much for that very, very kind introduction. And thank you, Rabbi Schaefer. I also want to thank my colleague, Judy Sachs, and my colleague, Jonathan Neerman, who are with us tonight. Judy's been with JVS for many years and actually started working with refugees several decades ago, both those coming from the former Soviet Union and arriving from Vietnam, and has had many, many years of direct experience working with refugees, Jewish and not. As Rabbi Schaefer said, it was a year ago, actually, that we talked, and which is kind of remarkable. We spoke about that earlier this evening before the beautiful service. And so tonight, well, it's really two events. It is indeed a Refugee Shabbat, but it also marks a year of all of us building community remotely. And I really appreciate being part of your community that you obviously have done so well in building, even in the midst of very difficult circumstances. As you know, and we've heard earlier, we are gathering tonight to participate in Refugee Shabbat, which is sponsored nationally by HIAS, known as the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society. We're also joining hundreds of congregations around the country who are celebrating Refugee Shabbat, really in every corner across the country. I spoke earlier today with Mark Hetfield, who's the executive director of HIAS. We shared some thoughts together as Refugee Shabbat began, and it's a really wonderful organization that has an incredible, rich history. HIAS was founded here in Boston in 1904, and today HIAS helps settle refugees from around the globe as one of the leading refugee agencies in the world. Mark Hetfield from HIAS has a wonderful saying. I think it's really a powerful idea. And he says, we, HIAS, used to take refugees because they were Jewish. Now we take them because we are Jewish. And in many ways, I think that's what Refugee Shabbat is all about. I'm going to talk tonight briefly about four things. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about what exactly a refugee is and how they differ from other immigrants. People may know this or not, but there's sometimes a little bit of confusion about that. Then next, I'm going to talk a bit about the current plight of refugees worldwide and give you some sense of the magnitude of the problem. And then thirdly, I'm going to say a little bit about what's happened to refugees over the past 4 years and how that's changed over the past 4 weeks. And then lastly, I'm going to say a bit about how JBS is continuing the Jewish community's longstanding work with the refugee community in the Boston area. So, Jonathan, if you wouldn't mind moving to the first slide, that would be great. Jonathan is my assistant in this effort here, so we can do a couple things at once. I'm not seeing the slide, but I knew we had all the technical.
It's here. Are you not seeing it?
Oh, okay. I don't know. Are people saying I don't see it?
Can someone confirm? Oh,
No.
No, we have to see.
okay. I just shared. Okay, let's try one more. That should be better.
Ah, okay.
All right.
If you could go on.
You got it.
Next slide. There we go. Terrific. It's a complicated issue about, you've probably heard many descriptions of different kinds of immigrants, who they are and what their legal status is. And I'm not going to go into all of it. For those of you who can see the screen, you can read that yourself. But I do want to say a couple of things about immigrants and refugees. So first of all refugees are immigrants, but not all immigrants are refugees. The two of the categories that you're seeing on the screen, I'm going to say a little bit about refugees, asylees, and then the last category, which is called temporary protected status, because those are the individuals that we tend to see most in the Boston area. So a refugee is an individual who cannot return to his or her country because of persecution or fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality. Often there is violence involved, and a refugee typically comes and gains their status before they enter the United States. So either they are living in a refugee camp, or they're living in another country outside their country of birth, and they receive refugee status by the United States State Department prior to coming into the United States. An asylee is an individual who has similar challenges, violence, war, persecution, but actually comes into the United States and then appeals for asylum. And so you're probably familiar with individuals who are coming from Central America and then crossing the border in the southwestern part of the United States, and that their situation is changing pretty dramatically, has changed pretty dramatically over the last several weeks, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. I do want to say a little bit about temporary protective status, because here in Boston, we come across this a lot, particularly in the Haitian community. Temporary protective status is a status for individuals who are coming or leaving another country because of some kind of an emergency situation, such as a hurricane or flood, or often a natural disaster. Here in Boston, the Haitian community, we actually have the third largest Haitian community outside of Haiti in the in Boston, with New York and Miami just being ahead of us. And many Haitians in the Boston area have temporary protective status, which has typically been, it's called temporary, but it's actually been extended almost on an annual basis until just several years ago in the previous administration. But even that was held up because of court decisions. So many people in the Boston area who are of Haitian descent have temporary protective status and have been here in some cases for 20 years. So, one thing I do want to say about refugees and asylees and individuals with temporary protective status is that they are all here in the United States legally. So most immigrants are also here in the United States legally. Actually, more than 80% in Massachusetts are legally documented immigrants. That's something that is often misunderstood. But all refugees are here legally, and all individuals that receive asylum are here legally, and all individuals with temporary protective status are here legally. And eventually, immediately upon getting refugee status and arriving in the United States, those individuals have the ability to work legally in the United States. Refugees is a little bit more complicated, particularly in the last 4 years, and same with temporary protective status. So, Jonathan, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. So the plight of refugees may be off the front page, but it has not slowed at all. In fact, there are more refugees today in the world than ever in our history. I think some of you are probably familiar with the headlines now 4+ years ago, when we saw the horrendous photos of Syrian refugees who perished as they were attempting to flee from Syria to Greece. That challenge of the Syrian refugees, as well as refugees from the world, around the world, as I said, although it hasn't been as much on the front pages of the newspapers, it hasn't slowed a bit. There are at least 79.5 million people around the world who've been forced to flee from their homes, and among them are nearly 26 million refugees, around half of whom are under the age 18. There are also millions of stateless people, in addition, who have been denied a nationality and lack access to basic rights, such as education, healthcare, employment, and freedom of movement. 1% of the world's population have fled their homes as a result of conflict or persecution. And unfortunately, that situation is getting worse, not better. The Syrian situation that many are aware of is particularly problematic. I think you probably know that the Syrian crisis has forced nearly half of that country to literally get up and walk and leave the country. Now, Jonathan, if you could just go to the next slide, that would be great. So I'm not going to let me just catch up with my notes here. I'm not going to talk in detail about the refugee resettlement process, which you can see, if you can make out the detail of the slides, it's probably a little bit small, and that's because it's very complicated. But I do want to point out a couple of things about the resettlement process, because this is something that has come up many times when people have talked about, particularly in the previous administration, about the risk of to security of allowing refugees to come into the country, particularly refugees from Muslim countries. So the refugee process, and I mentioned earlier, refugees will get their status while they're in the country before they come to the United States. This is a multi-year vetting process. When a refugee applies for refugee status, it's typically taking somewhere in the range of 2 years for all the investigation that goes on before individuals are ultimately allowed. It's often could be a 4-year process. The refugee process is probably the most thorough and in many ways the most secure way that immigrants come into the United States. And in fact, I always found it ironic when the refugee resettlement process would be attacked by political observers who didn't support refugee resettlement, and talking about what a very challenging national security issues. There are far easier ways, if an individual does want to get into the United States, for immigrants who are not refugees to get here. So the most common, of course, is someone comes on a tourist visa and overstays their visa. The asylum process, which is what you hear about for individuals fleeing violence in Central America and crossing the border in the Southwest, is going through dramatic changes now with the new administration. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Jonathan, if you could just move the next slide. What this slide shows is the historical pattern of refugee acceptance into the United States over since I think 1980 until last year, 2020. The number of refugees accepted into the United States each year is set by the president, in theory, in consultation with Congress. This must happen before October 1st each year. In fact, this is actually really a decision of the president, which is why the president of the United States has such power over what happens with refugees and their acceptance into the United States. Now, one thing I want to say is that the United States, until 4 years ago, was one of the most important, in many years, the most important country accepting refugees into our country. We, even though the numbers are relatively small compared to overall numbers of refugees, the United States was an enormously important provider of refugee acceptance. But as you can see, the numbers have dropped. They have been steadily dropping. And over the last 4 years, they dropped precipitously. So by the last year of the administration, of the Trump administration, effectively, no refugees were admitted into the United States. So you may have heard about a refugee cap, 15,000 refugees, but in fact, the cap was not met, and that's because what happened was the State Department ceased to process refugees coming from other countries. You can also see from this chart that in many years, even prior to this last administration, there's been a large gap between the cap of how many refugees can come in and the actual numbers of refugees allowed into the United States. So this question or issue of the cap that the president says sets each year is a little bit of a misnomer, because ultimately it is not only the cap, but what the State Department actually does in the country where they're processing and allowing refugees in. But the last 4 years, and particularly the last year, have been the lowest level of refugee acceptance into the United States since the program began. Jonathan, if you could just jump to the next slide. No, one more before that. Actually, so I think we changed the order. Go ahead, go forward 2 slides, if you wouldn't mind. There we go, perfect. So I just want to talk a little bit about what's happened in the last really month, 4 weeks, after 4 years of effectively ending the refugee resettlement program. And that is in addition to ending the Muslim ban on the first day of the administration by executive order. The Biden-Harris administration has implemented some very, very important changes that will impact refugee resettlement and immigration policies over the next several years. So probably the most important is that the administration expanded the number of refugee admissions that will happen in fiscal year 2022 from 15,000 to 125,000. This is an enormous jump. I do want to say something about this, because one of the big impacts of the last 4 years was not only keeping refugees from coming into the country, but because the refugee resettlement organizations like HIAS and its affiliates are funded by the federal government to resettle refugees. If there are no refugees coming in, the funding to resettle refugees disappears as well. And one of the very sad things that's happened over the last 4 years, which, by the way, was by design, was that that we had a situation where the infrastructure to resettle refugees really underwent a major crumbling. And in many in many cities, you had agencies that were responsible for refugee resettlement actually close their doors. Now in Boston, in the Boston area, we have been very lucky. We partner extensively with Catholic Charities. They've been able to maintain There were significant layoffs, but they were able to maintain. Why this is so important is because now that we're beginning again to resettle refugees in many cities around the country, they're going to have to start over again. So I just wanted to mention that. But the changes that have taken place over the last 4 weeks have really been remarkable. In addition to lifting the cap, there was one major change has been that there have been a number of delays on both the vetting process of refugees overseas, but also on how quickly, when refugees are resettled and when individuals get asylum status or temporary protective status, when they can begin to work in the United States. This is was a really tragic situation that's happened over the last several years, where individuals were here, they have asylum status, but they have not received their work permit. So it's a really terrible situation, because you've got individuals who receive public benefits for a period of time and then have no way to support themselves. That's also being changed under the Biden administration. So a lot of changes in the last 4 weeks, and over the next year, we'll see refugees begin to come back into the Boston area. So Jonathan, if you could just go back one slide. I want to talk a little bit about JVS and our own work in this area. As we said earlier, and I think Susan mentioned, we have been involved with refugee resettlement for more than 80 years of existence. When we were founded in 1938 to work with Jewish individuals that were already here in the United States, who were dealing with the unemployment of the Great Depression, as well as anti-Semitic job discrimination, we also were beginning to see refugees from Germany and Austria, and then later from across Europe, coming into Massachusetts. And we began working with those individuals then on increasing their learning English and getting their first job in the United States, and beginning to climb up the ladder towards the American dream. We do that today as we did then. It's the same work, teaching English that will allow people to get their first job, introducing them to important vocational skills, and connecting them with their first job. So at this point, our refugee department works with almost 1,000 refugees and immigrants annually to remove barriers to employment. We run vocational English classes, not just in the Boston area, but really across Massachusetts. And we also, in addition to helping with getting individuals their first job, we partner with organizations to ensure that they have legal assistance, help with benefits such as childcare, mental health assistance, medical assistance, so that in addition to being able to work and earn a living, they can make sure that they are in a safe and healthy environment. 4 years ago, the last thing I'll say about our own work, and then I'll stop and take questions, is that 4 years ago, with the election of the Trump administration, it was very clear to us that the refugee flow of refugees to the United States was going to come to an end. We weren't sure whether it would take a year or 2 or 3, but the administration was pretty clear that they were intent on ending the refugee flow to the United States. And we made a couple of decisions at that time. We said, here we have highly skilled staff. We have relationships with employers across Boston area and in Massachusetts. This was an important infrastructure that we knew we needed to continue to have for the day that refugees were going to come again. But we also knew that there were many, many refugees that were here already. We were aware of several thousand refugees in the Boston area who had been resettled over the last several decades, and particularly the last 10 years. And many of them were what I would call stuck at the bottom. So these are individuals who came as refugees. They really only have very few short months of any kind of assistance. And then they need to learn enough English and get their first job. So you're talking about a 3 or 4 month period, a challenge which is really hard to imagine. And they get their first job or first jobs, often with our help. But then they've got a family, they're working very hard, and it's very, very difficult for them to gain additional skills, learn more English, and begin to move up the ladder. And so our view was, well, if the administration was going to stop the flow of refugees coming into Boston for at least 4 years, we were going to turn our attention to the refugees that were here. A mission that we always wanted to focus on, but really never had the resources to do it. And we partnered with Combined Jewish Philanthropies and philanthropists around the Boston area. And in a few short months, 4 years ago, raised more than $3 million and have over the last 4 years worked with now almost 1,000 refugees who had already been resettled into Boston, in the Boston area, to increase their English skills, increase their training skills, move into better jobs, and with tremendous results. So while it has been a difficult 4 years for the refugees who are stuck all over the world, we were able to take advantage of the situation and work with those refugees that were here. And we're very grateful to the Jewish community for allowing us to do this. In the coming months, we will continue to work with refugees that are here, and we expect we will begin seeing the first new refugee arrivals coming into the Boston area, and we're beginning to make preparations for that. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to take questions if there are questions, and we can continue the conversation.
Thank you, Jerry. That was so informative. Also so sad to see some of those numbers and to realize the reality of what has changed in the last 4 years. We do have time for a couple questions. And if Ezra allows, perhaps Jerry will be able to stick around after services and schmooze a little bit and talk more. But if there's anybody who has a question, raise your hand, type it into the chat. I'm happy to call on you. Roger, let's
you're muted. Okay. Where are the refugees from? What countries are they from? The ones that you're working with now in the Boston area?
Yep. Really good question. So in Boston, well, they're from all over the world, but in the last, I'd say 5 years, the largest single group of refugees and asylees has actually come from Haiti, and that's the largest group that we work with. You know, if you're familiar with the situation in Haiti, it's a combination of all of the worst circumstances you can imagine. A combination of terrible political situation and an unending, unrelenting series of natural disasters piled on top of a very, very poor country. And so, as I said, Boston is one of the largest Haitian communities. We also have a significant, and the Haitian community in Boston is centered in Boston, Hyde Park, Mattapan in particular. But in addition to the Haitian community, the Central American community is quite significant, particularly in East Boston. There are many, many Central American asylees, also immigrants, but asylees and refugees. But we also have refugees from many countries in Africa. Interestingly, Worcester, Massachusetts has the largest per capita, the largest number. I think actually might be the overall largest number of refugees, because refugees are resettled with a formula that looks at housing costs and job availability. And of course, Boston is an expensive place to resettle a refugee. So in in Worcester, you find one of the largest groups of Central Africans resettled there. It's an enormous community. So those are a couple of the places.
Thank you, Jerry, and thank you, Roger. I have two questions. I'm going to just ask them both, and then after the conclusion of our service, hopefully we'll have a chance to ask some more questions. The first one is, how many refugees are considered environmental refugees as opposed to political war refugees, if you know those numbers? And the second is, what can you tell us about the data and information you have regarding long-term outcomes of the Jewish immigrants from Russia who arrived here in the past few decades? So happy to repeat those questions, if that's helpful for you.
Well, you know, the first, let me talk about the first question, the issue of environmental refugees, because I actually think this is something that we're going to be hearing about a lot more in the coming years. This is the impact of global warming has enormous implications for worldwide populations and the movement of worldwide populations. And I think we have seen already, but we will continue to see larger numbers of refugees who cannot survive in areas of the world and are just simply getting up and moving. It's actually an issue that I think the international community has not really dealt with but will have to deal with. Now, I do want to say that in many ways, the Haitian community are as much environmental refugees as they are political refugees. As I said earlier, Haiti has the unfortunate history of both having really horrendous politics, but also having had just one major natural disaster after another, not related particularly to, well, I suppose it's debatable whether some, you know, the major earthquake was not related to global warming, obviously, but some of the major storms that have hit Haiti, maybe. So in some ways, I think that the Haitian community is to some degree in kind of environmental refugees. But for the most part, refugee resettlement up until this time has really been the result of conflict and war and persecution, not the impact of environmental. But we're going to see more of that. There's no question about that. That's coming. The second question, about the Russian resettlement. So I don't want to put her on the spot, but my colleague Judy Sachs may know more about this than I do, and so I don't know, Judy, if you're willing to share.
Yeah, briefly, I would say that the Russian resettlement in the greater Boston area was enormously successful. Now, you understand, as opposed to refugees from other parts of the world who many of whom are not literate in their own language or have had very little education, the Russians, by and large, were very well educated and had, until the jobs were stripped from them, had very good jobs. I think that there was a pent up entrepreneurial spirit within the Russian community. You can imagine what they were not allowed to do in the former Soviet Union. The number of business startups and restaurants and travel agencies and folks that got jobs in high tech and engineering and health. It was a very, very successful resettlement of Russian Jews in the greater Boston area. And between the 90s and the mid 2000s, 123,000 Russian refugees, I just read, came to Massachusetts. And if I could say one thing, and I remember speaking to the folks at CJP about it, we missed a great opportunity. And that was to take a step back after the period of resettling Russians, to take a step back and to celebrate the enormous success of the community's efforts in Russian resettlement. But they were really outstanding.
Thanks, Judy. One thing I just wanted to add, because Judy's talking about the economic impact, and maybe we'll just finish with this, which is that the Massachusetts and New England in general has been losing its native-born. The native-born population has been shrinking for decades, and the data is very clear that had it not been for immigration, the city of Boston, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and the New England region would have actually lost significant population over the last 3 decades. And if you lose population, you cannot operate an economy. I mean, this is the problem. There are other countries around the world that have this problem now, and because we have an aging native-born population. I say this often to the refugee and immigrant clients that come to JVS, that had it not been for them, our city, our state, and our region would have been dead in the water. And in fact, we're a vital region and a vital city, and it's almost entirely attributable, at least from a labor force point of view and a population force. It is entirely attributable to immigration, which is one of the reasons why when not just refugee limitations were put on, but also immigration limitations, including high-skilled immigrants under what is known as the H-1B program. That's half of the CEOs of technology companies in Massachusetts come through that program. That's why the business community was so up in arms about it, because they understand that the secret to the success of our region has been immigration, and the refugees form a large part of that.
Thank you, Jerry. And I hope everybody will join me in offering you a virtual round of applause and gratitude for being with us tonight.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and thank you, Judy and Susan, for helping make this happen, and Jonathan for helping with our technology tonight. We're really grateful to have you, and if Ezra doesn't pull you away, you're welcome to stick around after to services and schmooze with us. And I hope everybody takes a few minutes after Shabbat to check out JVS and the amazing work that they do in our community. We're going to move towards the conclusion of our service by turning to Aleinu, which can be found on page 282. And I invite you to rise in body or spirit as Rabbi Berkman leads us at the top of the page.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שהוא נוטה שמיים ויוצר ארץ, ומושב עיקרו בשמיים ממעל. ושכינת עוזו בגופי מרומים, הוא אלוהינו אין עוד. ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא. ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו At this time, we call to mind those we have loved who are no longer with us in this world, but who live on in our hearts. So if you are reciting Kaddish at this time, either for a yahrzeit or you are in a period of mourning for a close loved one, I invite you to share their name in the chat. If the chat isn't accessible to you, please know that we're with you. If you stand and say the name aloud, we are with you, and even though we can't hear you, and blessings of comfort to all who are mourning. Mourner's Kaddish will be on page 294.
Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah. Be'alma divra chirutei yamlich malchutei b'chayechon uvyomechon ובחיי דכל בית ישראל בעגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעולם ולעלמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי לקודשה בריחו. לעילה מכל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה דאמירן ביעלמן ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן.
I want to share a few announcements about some of our upcoming programs, but first, a thank you to Josh for running our technology, to Gavi and Rabbi Jethro Berkman for joining us, and again to Judy, Jonathan, Susan, and Jerry for being with us this evening. Tomorrow morning at 10:30, we are celebrating the Bar Mitzvah of Josh Schwartz at 10:30. I hope you can join us. And there's also a special invitation out to our community if you'd like to join Shir Hadash at 10 a.m. for their Shabbat morning service. There's a Zoom link in your newsletter. You can find it there. And next Thursday, we have two exciting programs, Rabbi Berkman's weekly class, Torah for the Heart and Mind, which is at 9 a.m., and the second session of Finding Our Way, Jewish Perspectives on Medical Ethics with Dr. Muriel Gillick. We just had our first session on Thursday, and it was wonderful. And there are so many amazing Passover things coming up. You can get wine, custom wine from us. You can get amazing care packages, and you can sign up for our second night Seder on March 27th. Go to the website, check out all the information. Passover's coming up in a few weeks, and we hope you'll be celebrating with us. We're going to conclude tonight by offering a prayer for a better world, Olam Chesed Yibaneh, which was written by Rabbi Menachem Creditor.
And we'll be playing the audio of a recording that I made with our beloved Andy O'Connell, singing harmony and playing guitar, and we'll put the words on the screen so that we can join together. And then we hope to see some of you to just greet each other and perhaps with more questions for Jerry. And I want to add my thanks to you for such an informative and important talk.
Olam chesed yibane, yadadai, dai, dai, yadadai, dai. 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 I will build this world from love. Yadadai, dai, dai, yadadai, dai. And you must build this world from love. Yadadai, dai, dai, yadadai, dai. And if we build this world from love, yadadai, dai, dai, yadadai, dai, then God will build this world from love. Yadadai, dai, dai, yadadai, dai. Olam chesed yibane, yadadai, dai, dai, yadadai, dai. Olam chesed yibane, yadadai, dai, dai, yadadai, dai. Olam chesed yibane, Yadadai. Olam chesed yibaneh. Yadadai, dai, dai, yadadai, dai.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, everyone who joined us on the live stream. So nice to be with you in our virtual sanctuary, and we hope to see you next week.